Welcome to Wild Turkey Science, a podcast made possible by Turkeys for Tomorrow. I'm Dr. Marcus Lashley, Professor of Wildlife Ecology at the University of Florida.
And I'm Dr. Will Goolsby, Professor of Wildlife Ecology and Management at Auburn University. We're both lifelong hunters and devoted scientists who are passionate about hunting, managing, and researching wild turkeys.
In this podcast, we'll explore turkey research, speak to the experts in the field, and address the difficult questions related to wild turkey ecology and management.
Our goal
is to serve as your connection to wild turkey science.
So, predation, right?
Yes, predation.
And we're talking about this because predators do indeed eat a lot of turkeys.
Yeah, it would seem so. And I think something important, and our audience knows this by now, but this is one of those issues that it drives a lot of division.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot of argument, and it's really not over whether or not things eat turkeys. It's more about what should we do about it.
Yeah.
And that part of it in particular often gets kind of tiptoed around. But we're staying true to form here, and we're not going to do that.
No.
We're going to go right after it, knowing that this is a divisive issue, and I just want to remind everybody that we're trying to give you as well-rounded of a perspective on these things as we can, and give you the literature behind it, and try to talk about all the nuances and everything, and full well realizing that people argue about this online all the time. I mean, we see it. You get drug into it all the time, and it's also one of those issues that a lot of people just avoid even talking about.
Yeah, I've been dealing with this one for a long time because my PhD research focused on predator control for deer.
Mm-hmm.
So I've been going down this road for quite a while. Had a lot of time to think about it.
Well, it's not really divisive about deer, is it?
Yeah, not at all. None whatsoever.
Yeah.
The strange thing, well, I won't even go into that. We don't need to talk too much about deer because we got plenty to talk about with turkeys.
Yes.
But, as we started piecing this episode series together, I think initially you and I had planned to jump straight into what does the literature say about the efficacy of predator control for improving turkey production.
Mm-hmm.
But then as we got into that, we realized that there was so much to this dynamic that we probably needed to take a step back and do a little bit of an introductory episode to help people realize how complicated this whole issue is. I mean, predator-prey dynamics is a huge field of study with probably, thousands of published papers on it, for good reason, because it's complicated. It depends on the system. It depends on the context. It depends on the biology of the predator, the prey, their behavior, all sorts of things that we're going to go into. But like you said, Marcus, this is such a potentially contentious, attention-drawing, and divisive issue. And this morning, like I've told you before, sometimes I do my best thinking in my truck, which again, it's not saying much, but I was thinking, and I think the reason that it is so divisive for so many people is because we're not that far removed from a hunter-gatherer society, living close to nature.
Mm-hmm.
And, one of the reasons people don't like predators today, within the context of being, turkey enthusiasts, turkey hunters, is because predators are competing to eat that food source.
Mm-hmm.
We like to eat turkeys. They like to eat turkeys.
Yes, I'm a big fan of eating turkeys.
I am too. And I think that really, like I said, we're not that far removed from that point in human history. And I think that's what drives our passion as hunters, right? We're genetically programmed to be hunters, and that's why we're so passionate about it. And I think we're genetically also programmed to persecute predators because they compete with us for food. They threaten potentially, our kids when we lived close to nature and we didn't have the shelter that we had today, and we weren't, living in cities or well-established areas that are basically predator-free zones now. We lived much closer to that environment, and we directly competed with those other animals for food sources. So that is very hardwired into our system.
Yeah, that's a good point. That's a really interesting perspective as well. I think there's probably a lot of truth to that. That we, there are other things like we really like open environments,
Mhm.
right? And that's kind of linked biologically to our species as well. But yeah, really good points.
Did I
So
go too deep on that?
uh, maybe a little bit. I'm having to stand on the stool right now to reach. It's pretty far out there.
I've been known to
But
wax philosophical now and then, so
yeah, that's cool. I
a
do the
regular
same
a
thing.
a regular Socrates.
Yeah, is that it? You're Socrates, huh? I can't
That's
even spell Socrates. I'm gonna Google it. Yeah. Well, another thing, and I've already gotten some feedback, and I don't know if you have about this. A bunch of people have kind of they were paying us compliments really about it is the way I viewed about it, and some of them even went as far to say that is they really want us to get to the business of it and provide, okay, if you do X, you're going to get Y,
Mhm.
and then Z, is the reward you benefit,
Yeah.
that you reap from it. But I think this is one of those issues that it seems like there ought to be a really simple equation like that. And one of the things that I think we need to get into is why the equation is more complex than that.
Yeah.
And that doesn't mean that I don't support trapping or that I'm anti trapping. I know that you're not. And, you know, we support that is a tool in the toolbox. We
I've
both
used it.
have engaged in it. Yeah.
Mhm.
I know that you always say you've got a bunch of steel under your house. Well, I
Well,
know that to be true.
I was trying to avoid saying that again because I feel like I've already said it too many times and people are gonna start to doubt it.
Yeah. Well, maybe you could post a picture online that, but
From my
it
crawl
doesn't matter.
space.
Are there any turkeys in there?
There's probably an
So,
old foam decoy down there.
yeah, well, that's good. So, another reason, just before we really get into this one, which I guess this episode really is the lead off to a series. We have multiple episodes coming on this topic area. We wanted to kind of start at the basics. What
Mhm.
does the literature say eats turkeys?
Yeah.
Okay,
And I
so that's
think
really where we want to go with this. But before, and then I'm sorry to cut you off, but I'll let you go on right after I say this because I think it's important. This issue, one of the reasons I think it's divisive is because you kind of have these camps, and some people they don't feel that, or they don't have some of the other tools we talk about a lot.
Mhm.
They're leasing land, or they're in a situation where some of the habitat stuff is just not applicable.
Mhm.
And if they hear people really down on trapping, they view that as limiting them from using the only tool that they feel they have. And I
Yeah.
think that's an important perspective.
Yeah, I think it
And
is too. And
yeah,
and I
but
think one of the reasons they get fired up too is because they hear so much from us as biologists, habitat first, habitat first, habitat
hmm
first. And the reason that we do that is because we're just trying to make people well aware of how their priorities should be established. But I think
yes,
most people do recognize from some of the conversations we've been having online that
hmm
habitat is the priority.
right,
I do think that they understand that, but it's hard for me to sometimes to realize that they do because you post a habitat post and you post a predation post, the predation post gets way more traction, and that leads me to
hmm
believe that people are still hung up on that. So I'm just trying to make sure that we have a balanced perspective, and that's a lot of times why we talk about habitat
yeah.
first.
Well, and that's the reason it's important for us to have the dialogue and this longer form content where we can really go into this and try to give you a balanced view on what predators are eating turkeys. Is it a problem biologically? I mean, obviously the turkeys don't want to get eaten, but I'm talking about from a management standpoint. Is that something to be concerned about? What is the origin of the predation problem in terms of how it relates to other management activities? And then what are the expectations based
Hmm.
on what we have from the literature?
Yeah.
What should be your expectation
Hmm.
if you're going to do it? what should you expect?
Yeah.
The other thing that I think is pretty important, and I think we've covered it, we're going to cover it pretty well, is I hear people say, oh, time trapping just right, and it needs to be intensive. And then nobody actually quantifies what that means. So we're going to do that directly. And again, I'm so excited about the content. It's like, well,
Yeah.
let's just dump them all out this week, but we have to,
Yeah.
maintain our schedule. So unfortunately, you're going to sit on the edge of your seat for a few weeks to get through all of this. But also, the listeners, I hope, will keep that in mind that we're providing you different points of view. And just because we provide one in one week doesn't mean we're not going to counter that the
Yes.
next week.
Yes.
So,
Absolutely. Because that's one thing we've been getting a lot of comments on. It's like, well, what about this? You didn't talk about that. And it's like, trust me, we're getting
yes,
there. Not always.
yes,
We don't have everything perfectly
yeah.
covered. Um,
Unfortunately, we can't just dump all the episodes out at once.
yeah. I mean, people are used to the Netflix model now, right? Where a whole new season of a show gets uploaded
Yeah,
on one
yeah.
day. But yeah, I think kind of the goal of today, to go back to your earlier example, you talked about, people want to know X plus Y equals Z, or however that equation
Mhm.
looks with predation, and really what they're interested in is that solution Z, right? What does it equate?
Yes.
What does it come out to? Um, Man, I'll almost go out on a limb and say that equation looks more like letters uh, A through Y, all, there's plus signs, minus signs, division, multiplication, all in there. They all interrelate to each other to equal Z. It's very
Yes.
complicated.
Yes. I think that's probably a pretty good analogy.
But again, we've established we're not good at math. So
Yeah, that teaser from the episode the other day,
yeah.
that one cracked when I've watched it over and over again, it just cracked me up because that really and the other thing, like, I roomed with Chitwood. Like, we know each other very well.
hmm
We've worked together for a long time, and that really has been kind of how our dynamic was. He was doing some high level stuff, and I was the guy that was like, "Yeah, I'm not really good at math. Can you tell me again?"
Yeah. I mean, it's
But
always
I've been
good to have
pretty,
somebody like that to work with. You take them a data set and say, I want you to tell me what it says in this
yeah,
regard. Do your magic.
yes. And then I've always been better at communicating that to people that
hmm
or at least I view that as more of my strength, that I can understand at a basic level what he's talking about, but I understand pretty high level how I can convert that into things that are usable
Yeah.
for the
Right.
for the people out there that need to know to use it for
It,
management.
yeah. It definitely
So
takes a team.
yeah, so that having different strengths and a collaboration like that are really important. But I sent that to him and a couple of our friends that all know that dynamic, and they just thought it was hilarious.
Yeah. At least it was funny to us, right?
Yeah, about 3 people watched it on Instagram, so they thought it was funny too. I don't know if they were laughing with us or at us though.
I'm fine with either at this point.
Yeah, yeah, whatever. Okay, well, let's get into this stuff. We've kind of uh, done some high level thinking here for a minute, but uh, let let's get right into just what kills turkeys, and
hmm
we're talking about what does the literature say, and then we have some experience I think that we can bring to this, and I'm sure that people are probably going to point out a bunch of things that we leave out, but we're trying to be as general as we can and based on what people actually document in
hmm
studies that are tracking turkeys that get eaten by something.
hmm Yeah.
So
And the answer to that question depends on life stage, right?
yes, it does quite a bit. So that's what I was going to kind of throw to you to start with. Let's think about an adult turkey,
hmm
and we'll start. We could even start with males. I think that one's the easiest to just knock out.
Yeah.
What is killing adult male turkeys?
So primarily, based on what I've read, great horned owls are a big one. Um, Humans are probably bigger than anything. I mean, we're
Yeah.
the number one predator, through hunting seasons
Mm-hmm.
of adult male turkeys. So probably after that, you'd be somewhere in the mix would be great horned owls, your other larger birds of prey, maybe a golden eagle here and there. Of course, they're a lot more rare and scarce across the landscape. So probably not a significant mortality source in a lot of places. Coyotes, for
Mhm.
sure. Bobcats, probably to a lesser extent with males, but definitely on hens.
Mhm.
Um, am I
Well
missing something?
no, I think you're giving a pretty good span of the ones that I see too, but I also had a little story, from a hunting experience.
Hmm.
And I know this is gonna probably shake people up, and this is gonna be the clip that everybody grabs and shares everywhere, which I guess is fine. Uh, I've been wondering about coyotes for a while,
Hmm.
and, I know that you have a really deep understanding of the literature where people have looked at the diet of coyotes.
Hmm.
So, I was hunting with a friend over in Mississippi a couple of years ago, and it was in a place that's got some turkeys. I was expecting to hear turkeys gobbling, and it was a pretty good morning. I wasn't hearing anything. I had been walking miles. I mean, I'd lost 15 pounds, from walking because I'd just been all over the place trying to hear a turkey gobble, and I wasn't hearing anything.
Hmm.
And because I'm kind of strange and curious, when I come across scat, just something has left us a little scat sample. It doesn't matter what the species is. I just, especially when I'm walking around the woods, I just have that curiosity and I dig around in it. Well, in this
Barehanded?
particular, do what?
Barehanded?
Well, I'd usually try to find a stick or something that,
Poke it with a
sometimes
stick.
sometimes I take the plug out of my shotgun and use that.
You weren't using it for anything else.
Yeah, I certainly didn't need multiple shells in my gun this day. So, but just being that curious person and hunter, I saw a coyote scat, and it kind of just caught my eye immediately because I just look around and scat. But this one in particular, it had a a little black triangular thing sticking up straight up out of it, and I realized very quickly it was a turkey's toenail.
Hmm.
And I was like, I mean, it just shook me, right? I was like, oh, whoa, 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 whoa. I got to see what's going on here. So I dug around in the scat and I found a couple of toenails and some foot pads. And it looked like to me, it was a gobbler,
Hmm.
like in the scat, and it was coyote. So did it kill that gobbler? I don't know. I don't know if it did or if it just found a foot laying around somewhere or yeah, I don't know what happened. I didn't kill the turkey. I know
Hmm.
that. But I don't know, if he killed the turkey or not. But it got me really curious. And I did a post on this actually on Instagram. So some people may have seen this post. I put a bunch of the pictures of this, and then we did a full literature review. And I think we even have on Facebook or something. We have a list of all the citations, directly linking people to all the literature on it. But it was really interesting reading. I basically went through all of the coyote diet stuff, and I know that
Hmm.
you've done some of that work,
Yeah.
trying to figure out how often do turkeys show up in their diet.
That's why you
And,
still like to dig through scats because you weren't part of one of those projects where you had to dig through hundreds of them like I was.
well, you'd be surprised at how often I've been involved in those projects. Not I've been tangentially involved in the ones on coyotes, but a couple of the students that have been through my lab have been looking for seeds in them
Okay. All
for
right. Fair
various
enough.
reasons. So, but it's just it's just one of those curiosity things for me. I just want to see what they've been doing.
Hmm.
And anyway, when I looked through a bunch of the scat studies, some of them you're an author on, I think, but it became really apparent that birds are kind of common.
Hmm.
They show up in the coyote diet a lot.
Hmm.
But the problem with a lot of the literature in terms of what my curiosity was is it's not very common that they tell you what type of bird, like is it a turkey or not?
Hmm.
But they're pretty common in the diet.
Yeah.
And the few studies that did try to isolate what kind of bird showed that turkeys, in some cases, are I wouldn't say a huge portion, but it's not an insignificant portion of their diet in some cases,
Yeah.
which, you know, as an anecdote that a lot of our audience can probably relate to, you've probably been in that situation where you put out a decoy somewhere and you're calling, or maybe you're just, trying to sound like a hen or whatever. And then a coyote comes in and stalks your decoy. And to me, I interpret that interaction as they probably wouldn't try to catch your decoy thinking it's a real turkey if they never caught a real turkey. And
Yeah.
particularly when a gobbler's strutting and doing his business and has his mind set on a particular thing, I just wonder about that. But we don't
Yeah.
have very good data on that interaction. But the other thing thinking about, I know we're going to
But
talk about some of
you're
the
right though. It
landscape
is
context. The coyotes haven't been in the Southeast for that long,
right.
really, in the grand scheme of things. We're talking about a few decades in most places, and
Mm-hmm.
some places maybe 5 or 6 or 7 decades. But they're relatively young in
Right.
terms of a presence here in the Southeast and a lot of our states.
And especially as you get up into the Mid-Atlantic region, they really haven't
Mhm.
been there that long. Um, but yeah, there's kind of a lot to unpack there. I mean, one thing that immediately came to mind is that just you talking about general examination of use of turkeys by like an animal like coyotes.
Mhm.
A difficulty there is that birds are really digestible.
Yeah.
And if you don't pick up on things like you did, like toenails and foot pads and things like that, it's really
Yeah, the
hard to make
things that
that.
are tough to digest, yeah.
Yeah, it's hard to make the determination of what species was consumed, and
Mhm.
then also you may not even have any sign left over once it's been processed because it is so digestible, especially with young turkeys
Yes.
or young birds in general or small birds because they are so digestible. Um,
Right. Well,
but
and so just for the audience, you brought this up to me one time, and I think it's an important point. A lot of people may not understand how we're quantifying that. So when people are doing these types of studies, there are two major ways that we do that kind of research to figure out how common an item is. And that, one is to weigh the overall mass. So you have a scat and you kind of figure out, okay, what proportion of the scat is in different
yeah,
items. And the other way, and they're commonly done together in the same study, is how many of the scats do you detect an item in? So in
hmm
other words, if you had 10 coyote scats, how many of those 10 have bird
yeah,
in it
yeah,
or have turkey in it? So we kind of look at them from that frequency and the biomass standpoint. But
yeah,
so I think that's an important thing to kind of get people wrapping their head around how those kinds of studies are done. But you can see based on what you just said, because relative to a mammal that has a bunch of hair on it that they're pretty much going to eat no matter
hmm
what. If a coyote eats a small mammal, we're going to have some hair in it that
yeah,
doesn't digest well. So that'll be represented pretty well. If they eat a mammal, you'll generally detect it in the scat.
right,
But birds, they're much more digestible, especially young birds.
right,
But you
yeah,
could imagine a hen with some poults. I mean, what does she do? She just kind of, she might flush if they can fly, but before they can fly, a lot of times you'll see that hen and you may not even see the poults.
hmm
She'll kind of stick around, and that may be a cue. And to be clear, I have not seen good data on it, but I
yeah.
just wonder about it.
But yeah, and I mean back to your other point earlier, it's hard to talk to a seems like avid turkey hunter these days that hasn't had a coyote or bobcat come in when they're calling,
Hmm.
especially if they've got a decoy out in front.
Yes.
That's a pretty
When
commonly shared experience.
yeah, I've even seen online a few times. I feel like where someone actually had a bobcat on them. Like
Yeah,
the hunter had you're sitting there and I guess the bobcat's jumping in the bush to get the hen and you're the bush.
yeah.
So
I'm not a fan.
no, I do not like that interaction.
Can I
I
tell a
haven't
couple?
had it personally, but I can imagine that it's undesirable.
I got to tell a couple quick coyote scat stories if I can. I just think
I need you to.
I think
I
these are worth.
really need you to tell me
I
a
think these are
coyote
worth
scat
sharing.
story.
I think these are worth sharing. The funniest thing I've ever found in a coyote scat is on this study site, and this. Well, I should back.
The
I sh-
funniest thing. We're
what?
telling the funniest thing in coyote scat
Yeah, I
stories.
got
Yes,
two stories. They'll
please
be
do.
quick, I promise. But first, I should back up and share the data. So that was That was a study that I was part of in Central Georgia back a few years ago. It was James Kelly's master's research project, and we were guilty of the same thing that you called out. Some of those other papers for. We grouped all bird together,
Hmm.
and in that early spring period, about 20% of coyote scats had some bird
Oh, wow.
material in it. Yeah, so
Yeah. We need to
different.
share this paper. You said it was Kelly.
Yeah,
Was
yeah.
it he was lead author on it?
Hmm.
Okay.
Yep. And I actually got a listener ask me about some of this just the other week, specifically pertaining to whether or not coyotes might keep down populations of nest predators.
Mhm.
And he was specifically interested in coyote consumption of raccoons and opossums. And
Yeah.
in that paper, we didn't find much use of those species by coyotes at all,
Yeah.
which is not particularly surprising for raccoons because they're a pretty formidable opponent, even for a
Yes.
coyote. But a possum, I don't know what the deal is with those. I guess maybe it's just a preference thing. They don't really want to eat them. I
Yeah.
don't want to eat possum, so I don't blame them.
Yeah, I can see why that might be, uh, off the menu.
But while we're
What
talking about their palate, this gets me back to our story.
hang
So,
on, one more thing. I
all
gotta
right,
interject.
all right,
Chitwood actually is the well, he and I worked on it. I can't remember who the lead author is, but we could share this one too. We actually tried to look at interactions between coyotes and raccoons, and
yeah,
in that paper, we went through all the documented interactions, so
okay,
we could share that too.
okay, good. Um, so while we're talking about coyote, the coyote palate, and what I just shared about not really eating possums may speak to their palate being fairly refined. One might think. However, the funniest thing that I ever found in a coyote scat is, we had these survey routes that we'd drive along. You see a turd in the road, you get out, you, you get out, you put on a latex glove, grab a Ziploc sandwich bag,
You were just wearing that glove. You already had it on in the truck.
and you drop it. You drop it in the bag, take the glove off. A lot of times, we throw the glove in the bed of the truck, and because we're going around slow, so they're not likely going to blow out. But every now and then you have an accident, right? And a glove blows out, or you drop one, doesn't quite make it over the
You
side of the
forget to put
bed.
it on your hand.
The next week, we found one of my turd picking gloves in a turd.
That is amazing. That
So
is a circle of life if I've ever heard it right there.
I picked up a coyote poop with a glove, took the glove off, it fell out in the road. A coyote ate it and pooped it right back out the next week.
Yeah, that is
Second,
hilarious.
second funniest story closely related to it. We were running genetic analysis on all these coyote scats because we were using that as a way of tracking population size.
Mhm.
And we're going to have Dr. Dana Morin on at some point in the future to talk about how she's doing that with turkeys too, as kind of a tie-in. So we were doing genetic analysis on all of them. I was outsourcing that to another lab because obviously I'm not a conservation geneticist. And that collaborator would send me back reports of the genetic analysis of each of these cats, and we were not only trying to look at which individual, identify unique individuals from their genotypes, but we were
Of
also
coyotes. You're
yes,
trying to so that you can tell from the scat based
hmm
on genetics which coyote
yeah,
individual laid that scat.
yeah. But the
Okay.
first cut we take before that is to determine what species was responsible, because sometimes coyote scats, fox scats, bobcat scats can look very similar to each other.
Mhm.
So we did a species typing first, then an individual typing second. And one of the scats that I had picked up, I got the data set back, and it came back as human. So I immediately sent an email
Hang
back
on. Wait.
back to the
I have some
geneticist that
questions. I have some
I'll
questions.
answer him. Just give me a second. I immediately send an email back to the geneticist I'm
Did
working
you
with,
genotype the human?
and I asked him. I said, "Did I just genotype some unsuspecting hunter's poop?" And I'm sitting here wringing my hands and all worried about it. Like I just the irony of the whole situation. And finally, I get the email response back, and he said, "No, that was likely just sample contamination.
Okay.
Like we weren't sterile in our collection of that scat, and we got some human skin cells on it or something like
Did
that."
you did you not wear a glove on that one?
I don't know. I mean,
Oh my
maybe
gosh, you can't drop that kind of stuff on me
maybe I was
when we're
tired that day
laughing.
and forgot my glove.
Maybe you wore the glove between the bathroom break and the scat. Oh my gosh. Or maybe the coyote ate human scat. Is that a possibility?
That is a distinct possibility,
What are all these peanuts?
especially if he's anything like my dog. I wouldn't doubt it.
Yes, my dog would definitely be the first one in line. Well, my story seems a bit underwhelming now. I was gonna throw one in, but just kind of as a some scat stories. Since I guess I did already give one, but I'm gonna give you one more because it's been rolling around in my head and bouncing around for a while. And I'm talking about when I say a while, I'm talking about a decade. And I tell the story to my students when I'm teaching a lot because it's just remarkable to me. One of the number one items in North Carolina when we were doing this scat work, and another graduate student was leading it, but I was there and involved. One of the leading items that we had were persimmon seeds.
Mm-hmm.
And everybody out there that's looked at coyote scat, you see a cluster of seeds, there are going to be some persimmons in it.
Or muscadine or blackberry, like
Yeah.
depending on time of the year and where you're
Yeah.
at. Yeah.
Well, the persimmon's obvious because the seed's so big and it's so
Mhm.
recognizable.
Yeah.
And coyotes they like persimmons. They just like them. I don't blame them. I like them. But it was pretty interesting to me when we started going around into the spring and then into the summer, and we were still finding persimmon seeds in it. And some of the time, it was as far away from when there would be ripe persimmons as you could get in the year.
Mm-hmm.
And it was still a very common item. Like almost every scat has some persimmon seeds. So I've just been racking my brain on where are they getting them? So then we've kind of come up with some hypotheses over time, and I haven't tested any of these, but it's just food for thought, right? That was a pun. It was a bad one. Really bad. But I was like, okay, they're eating persimmons. That makes sense. They get persimmon seeds in it. Are they caching them? And they're just going somewhere and digging them up? Or are they eating each other's scat and you just keep passing the seeds along? Now there's a new hypothesis. Maybe they're eating human scats that have, yeah. Yeah, I just could never figure that out, but it was so remarkable to me that there always are persimmon seeds in it, at least in that study. It was just,
Yeah.
they were always there.
Yeah.
And you couldn't even find a persimmon in the landscape, and they would still be in the scat.
Yeah. That's wild.
So anyway, let's move back to turkeys. We've been on scat for a while.
I see your pun and raise you one. Are we done talking?
Did you just gobble?
I'm prone to do that. It is, the weather's turning. Spring is around the bend. So,
yeah, you're going to be a herald of the dawn, I see.
Okay.
All right.
Where
were we at?
We talked about, primary predators of adults, particularly with particular emphasis on gobblers.
What about
those,
hens?
Those same predators kill hens. I think an important point to make here is that the majority of predation, or a disproportionate amount of predation, occurs on hens when they're on the nest.
Yes. I think that is a really important point. And in one of our future episodes, I think that point is going to become more important.
Yeah.
But I think that's something that people really need to understand is that, you have a hen sitting on the nest and she's doing it through the night. And
there's a reason they don't sleep on the ground year round.
Yes. She's really vulnerable at that point. And I think that is an important point that we need to keep in mind that, during that reproductive event, the hen herself is very vulnerable.
Mm-hmm.
And then we talked about a minute ago, she may even be vulnerable pre-flight with poults.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I don't know how much data we have on that, but based on their behavior, I think we could safely assume that that may be the case.
Yeah. Yep. And then during that period, she'll actually, against most raccoons and possums, similar sized creatures, anything up to kind of the size of a fox, she'll
Hmm.
protect that nest,
Yeah.
against anything that she possibly can. And, there's been some listeners that have shared those videos with us, and you
Yeah,
in
I was gonna
particular.
say, yeah, I shared a video or series of videos because when it was somebody that follows me on Instagram shared it with me, and it it was kind of shocking to me just watching. So basically, this guy, but the way he described it, he was walking through the woods, he flushed a hen, and he just had a trail camera that he was going to put out, or he had just picked up or something,
Hmm.
and it was one of those cell cameras. And he asked me actually via DM, "Hey, what is it going to be okay? What about it?" And I was just like, "Just get back off, get away from it. She might come back." And he was like, "Could I throw my camera up real quick?" And we were like in real time.
Yeah.
And I was like, "If you have it on you, do it, but get out of there. Don't go back to the house and get one. Don't.
Yeah.
So just for the audience, that's good practice. If you don't want to go out necessarily seeking out hens to flush them to put a camera there. That's a bad
Hmm.
idea because they don't always come back. Sometimes they abandon it, and that
That's why,
well,
as much as we would like to set cameras up over the nest of every hen that we track in these studies, we
yes,
don't do it because
yeah,
you're
because
gonna
there's so the risk,
get
yeah,
some abandonment. And I think the number that I've heard thrown around in a conversation I had with Brett Collier a while back was maybe like 20 or 25% of
okay,
those hens that you bump they're going to abandon. I may
yeah,
be
we
wrong. We need to
can,
ask him when he comes back on.
yeah, we're recording with him another episode here in a few days. Let's ask him about that. uh, but anyway, don't go around trying to put cameras on nests. But in some cases, these ones that have been sent to us, somebody had already made that mistake and it was an accident, and they just happened to have a camera with them and they plopped it up.
Right.
And in this case, the hen came back. And the reason I brought it up was kind of, some anecdote about how interesting the behavior is of the hen.
Hmm.
And you saw it on a
Yeah.
couple of the posts. I'll post this again. It went around made the rounds, but if people are looking for it, I'll share it again right when this comes out. The hen, it just this I think it was a possum in the particular case, kept coming by, and
That's what
she
I
was
remember as
defending
being a
it.
possum.
She was defending it from the possum, and she
Hmm.
was going into full strut and literally
Yeah.
running this possum off. And
Yeah.
I just thought it was just unbelievable.
Yeah.
Like she was, I think I wrote on there, she was in beast mode. Like
Uh-huh. Yeah.
mama's about to about to tear somebody up.
Yeah.
And I just thought that was pretty remarkable. So, we talk about these nest predators, and I know we're going to get to that in a few minutes, but that behavior is pretty remarkable, and she'll actually defend her nest from a lot of things. And I think
Hmm.
I've heard you talk about things, what she'll defend her nest from.
Yeah.
But yeah,
Pretty
that
much anything
video,
up to the size of a fox or so.
yeah. So, and if you can imagine if she's defending herself from a fox or a bobcat or a coyote, she might
Yeah.
get dead.
Yeah. She's done.
Yeah. So, I think that's really the point there is she's going to defend. And one of the videos that I posted on there, she had little poults. You can just kind of see them. They're little specks on
Hmm.
the video because they're so small, but they scatter and go everywhere. And then she basically runs around in full strut and to run this possum off. And then
Yeah.
she gets back in the little nest, and they all run back and get under her wings, and it was so awesome.
Yeah.
But yeah, that I think that's there are a couple of important points for that. One, she's super vulnerable in the nest.
Hmm.
Two, it's not the nest is vulnerable as a result of her being vulnerable.
Yeah.
And those two things are all interlinked in with habitat quality as well because she's super vulnerable while she's on the nest, and particularly if she's nesting in a poor
Hmm.
situation,
Yeah.
that magnifies her risk
Yeah. So
because just things are going to see her more easily and interact with her more commonly, and she may have to. and that could also play into other things, like if she's having to repeatedly ward off things, even if she keeps them from getting the egg successfully, if it's a nest predator, and she just repeatedly has to go back and over, and like night after night, she's having to deal with that. That could even play into some other physiological
Hmm.
problems, like she just runs down her energy reserves or something. But
Sure.
yeah, I think that's something we should definitely emphasize, that the hens, they're very much vulnerable during that
Right.
nesting period, and potentially early with poults as well.
Right. So what eats nest?
What indeed? I
it,
think,
it it
yeah, go
varies a
ahead.
little bit from one study to another, but I would say, overall, raccoons are generally probably
Hmm.
going to be at the top of the list in more studies than not.
Yes, they're definitely one of the top ones usually,
Hmm.
unless they're in a place, I guess, that there aren't raccoons. They're generally pretty high.
Yeah. But of course, you can throw opossums in the mix. Uh, we already talked about coyotes, foxes. They don't just eat hens; they eat bobcats too. They don't just
Hmm.
eat hens; they eat eggs too. Skunks,
Hmm.
armadillos,
Yeah,
rat
snakes.
snakes. Yeah,
Hmm.
snakes are a big one.
There's
Um,
been some cool videos about that too, where a hen was really getting after a snake. I've seen a few
yeah,
videos of that.
yeah. Um, Birds, especially like if the hen is
Like,
on a recess, and those eggs are uncovered.
yeah,
Corvid
like the
predation's
corv.
a big
Yeah.
thing. Yeah,
So
crows
we're
and blue
yeah, crows,
jays.
crows and jays. Yeah.
Yep,
You know,
those are
there's
those are
another
big ones.
interesting anecdote from historical writings about this. If you want me to say Dr. Bartram again for a minute.
Yes, please, please be Dr. Bartram.
So, well, I'll talk about Audubon for a minute. I did this segment last turkey season. A lot of people, our audience, might already know about it, but if you're really interested in the historical writings about turkeys, it was under the hashtag Wild Turkey History, and sort of like a collection of posts on Instagram on that. But I was basically just going through everything I could find written about turkeys, and I'm talking about circa 1500 till you know the 1900s, early
Hmm.
1900s, and it was really fun. Man, there's all kinds of great things, and I didn't share all of them. I might do it again this year, but there were several things that really stuck out to me. One was from Audubon, and it made me really appreciate that guy, because we're sitting here talking about digging around in scat because of curiosity. That was one curious dude,
Yeah,
and I just have grown to really appreciate him for it. But he had some passages where he was talking about. I mean, from what I could tell, it's sort of vague, but from what I could tell, this dude like found a turkey on a nest, and during a recess or something, he crawled in there, and he's like laying around in the woods, hiding from this hen, and then watching all her behavior on the nest.
that's wild.
It's 1792. This dude's literally he's laying around in the woods watching turkeys
He's going
on a
full.
nest.
He's going full like Carlos Hathcock sniper. Just, I picture him
Yeah,
crawling. I picture him crawling up there in a ghillie suit.
yeah. I don't know what he was doing, but I appreciate it.
It may have been
You know,
knickers, but he crawled up.
well, I don't know. I'm trying to envision what he's doing, and it's not super clear from the passage that I found what the circumstances were, but I just appreciated how curious he was. But yeah, and it wasn't clear how long, but based on the writing, it sounded like he laid there for a long time. You know, and think about it, it was hard to even just survive back then. You know what I'm saying? Like he he should have been trying to figure out how to eat, and like chopping wood for like he had some other things to do,
Yeah,
and
but
this dude's
two
laying around in the woods.
he two of those things that he had to do weren't listening to podcasts or scrolling Instagram. So
That's right.
I
That's
mean,
right. He had some
that
time.
was his live feed, right?
Yeah. But anyway, we're getting on story time a lot. Uh, One of the things that kind of stuck out to me with all these historical writings is, do you know how many times I saw raccoons mentioned when they were talking about nest predators or whatever?
I would think it'd be a lot.
I would have too, and it was almost never.
Mm-hmm.
When I
Wow.
saw some passages related to that, they really talked about corvids, or crows in particular, and snakes. I found those both referenced some,
Mm-hmm.
but it was a little more rare for raccoons.
Yeah.
And that's something, people ask about how things have changed in the predator context, and that kind of, that anecdote kind of leads me to believe that things have changed a lot.
Mm-hmm.
And if you look at some of the stuff Bartram wrote, some of the quotes, some of the stuff that Boone wrote in Kentucky, they described the landscape as being this big, giant, open savanna.
Mm-hmm.
And you can see I have these historical writings under that hashtag if you want to go read them. Like I wrote some of these out. But they also described, when I was going through the turkey stuff, a landscape where there were turkeys gobbling. One of them was, they said that they were gobbling for 100 miles in every direction. They were lamenting about not being able to sleep because of all the gobbling. Boone was talking about going basically across Kentucky all the way over to the river and never being outside the sight of
Mm-hmm.
turkeys, which of
Right.
course it had to be an open landscape, but there also has to be a lot of turkeys.
Yeah.
Like they're describing what I'm kind of gathering as a landscape that there's as many or more turkeys as there was trees.
Yeah.
So it's this wide open, high sunlight environment, probably really frequent fire to maintain it in that early succession community structure. Uh, but that landscape has changed dramatically.
Mm-hmm.
Another thing that just kind of resonated with me about that with raccoons is there's some data on raccoon movements. They don't really like that kind of landscape. They're kind of a mesic species.
Yeah.
Water, they're often associated with streams or, low areas. And I wonder if, that landscape context, maybe they just weren't in the uplands very much like they are now, because of that landscape context.
Well, intuitively, if you're trying to catch raccoons, you're focusing around areas that have water. I mean,
Yeah.
it's a totally different area versus if you're targeting coyotes. When you're
Hmm.
trying to be primarily in those upland open type,
Yes.
cover types versus raccoons. So that, I
Hmm.
mean, that makes sense, and there's research backing it as well.
Right. Yeah. And there have been a couple of studies where they looked at raccoon behavior and how they interacted with like recently burned areas and stuff.
Hmm.
So it's definitely something to think about. And the landscape context, from a habitat standpoint, there's no question that it's changed dramatically in
Hmm.
just a couple hundred years.
Yeah.
Like it's a completely different place. So I think that's important. Another thing that I know that you and I both get challenged with this a lot, and so I was just going to ask you, how much do you think the predator landscape has changed? We've got a couple hundred years now that
Hmm.
we're talking about. How much do you think the predators have changed? Because you always hear everybody talk about predators being way more abundant now than they were 50 years ago or
Yeah.
whatever. But let's think about over that 200-year period.
Well, I'll caveat my answer by saying that at least at the start of it, we're going to be venturing off into land of speculation for a little while because we
Yes.
don't have data to go back and look at that historical landscape and actually have robust population estimates of nest predators or adult predators or
Mhm.
whatever.
Yeah, we had Audubon laying around in the woods, for a few nests.
Yeah, yeah. I don't know. It's hard to say because I could see people lived closer to land back then. There was a lot more subsistence hunting going on. But they were technology limited, right?
Mhm.
They were, depending on what time period you're talking about, sticks and stones or maybe flintlocks. So because they were subsistence societies. And even early on, when we started to have agricultural societies, people still lived way closer to the land. And my guess is that they probably killed anything that came around that potentially posed a threat to their livestock or the wildlife that they depended on for a food
Mm-hmm.
resource, including turkeys,
Well,
which we know historically turkeys were a really important food source for Native American people and then early
yeah,
European settlers too.
for sure. Yeah,
Um,
that was actually most of the references I found were about a meal or something that
yeah,
was centered around turkeys or
right.
the
And so
domestication process of turkeys even.
if you're talking about 1800s, man, it's hard to say. I could imagine per capita there were more people killing predators, persecuting
Mhm.
predators at that point in time compared to now because so many of us just, live in cities or don't hunt, don't go outdoors. They don't, don't even, much less tote a gun in the woods,
Mhm.
so each individual was probably killing more predators at that time. But
Well,
like I said,
another thing is they probably were eating them too.
yeah, sure.
I
But
know
they
that
did,
they were eating a lot of people eat raccoons. I
sure.
mean, it ju
But they weren't as effective at killing them
right,
as we
right.
potentially can be if we choose to participate in that activity nowadays. So they
Yeah,
don't have dog-proof traps or foothold traps or
right. Yeah,
modern
those
shotguns or rifles. So
yeah, that the steel traps, I think it was, like, right at the turn of the, 19 right around 1900, early what is it? Late 1800s, I think, is when they became widespread available.
okay,
So
mass produced.
I'd have to go look that up again, but I'm pretty sure that was about the time frame. But a lot of these historical writings that we're talking about,
Hmm.
there were far fewer people, but they were probably per capita killing more predators than people today, at least on
Right.
average. But there were far fewer people. But the other thing that I think is an interesting tidbit to think about and roll it around in your head for a minute, they were describing a landscape that was absolutely covered up with turkeys. They
Yeah.
didn't have any steel.
Yeah.
What? Those traps weren't available.
Right.
So that's an important thought to
Yeah.
have. They were
Yeah.
describing a place that was the turkeys were tearing the woods down every
Yeah.
morning.
Right. And it's hard to really disentangle, why that was.
Mhm.
But given what we know about turkey habitat preferences, it's hard, and what we do know about the historical accounts of that landscape, it's hard to imagine that it wasn't habitat driven. Not only in the sense that you're providing quality nesting and brooding cover, right? But you're
Mhm.
providing it across a large acreage. And like I talked
Yeah.
about in that bonus episode we did last Thursday, you just keep increasing the size of that haystack that you have to
Mhm.
find the needle in, making it more
Yeah.
difficult for predators.
When the entire
And
landscape is nesting and brooding cover,
yeah,
turns out they do pretty well.
and as you mentioned, those conditions are less make the habitat less suitable for the primary nest predators.
Mhm.
So you've got multiple things interacting to positively potentially influence reproduction.
Yes, that's good.
Um, I don't think that the turkey numbers that those individuals, again, we're still in the land of speculation because this is historical. We don't have the data sets. They didn't
Yeah.
have the
Well,
technology to collect those data sets.
and
But
there's a lot of disagreement among scientists about how accurate the open landscape was because they probably were traveling through open places. But when you collectively look at all their writings, I mean, we're talking about a lot of different places that were wide open.
yeah,
Now, the actual percentage, maybe that varies a little bit. There is a publication that tried to estimate the actual percentage of the landscape. And I posted that map one time. Uh, but yeah, I'm in agreement with you. There's a lot of uncertainty around those, but we can glean some things from those
yeah.
writings as well.
Yeah. So I don't know. I mean, I don't think it was. I don't think that those turkey numbers were being primarily driven by human removal of predators. I think it was probably more of a landscape composition. But again, we're in this realm of speculation here.
Hmm.
I think it was probably more driven by the landscape conditions being very conducive to turkeys, and much less so for the predators that are primarily responsible for taking, especially nest.
Hmm. Yeah. Well, what about the trapping data? There is some more contemporary data.
Yeah. Yeah. So, generally, I mean, we know that trapper participation is down across the
Hmm.
board compared to what it was, like in the 70s, 80s, especially, because fur prices are so far down. And then it's also kind of a lost art. There's not
Yeah.
many people that even know how to do it. Now that's starting to change. And I do feel like I've heard some whispers of people talking about in certain states increase trapping license sales over the past several years. Like people are getting back into predator removal, predator control, or maybe just recreational trapping.
Hmm.
I don't necessarily know what their motivations are, but we know that we're not taking as many, especially like raccoons, off the landscape as we were, 30, 40, 50 years ago for
Hmm.
certain. And
Yeah.
I
I
mean,
sort
just
of
as
view that as a hump shape. Just think about over that long, over a 200-year period.
yeah.
We may not have had that many being taken off the landscape 200 years ago plus.
Hmm.
The average number per individual was probably much higher, but
Yeah.
there were so few individuals that were doing it. It was probably a lower number of predators. And then, we kind of went through that heyday where the fur trade and the widespread use of traps and everything, these more modern techniques, we probably, you know, relatively, there are more people, probably relatively more predators per person,
Hmm.
and then that kind of leads to more being taken from the landscape. And then in the more recent decades, even though there's a lot more people, it's far fewer per capita
Yeah.
removal.
Lower participation. Yeah.
Hmm.
But to kind of more, directly answer your question, I think some of this is changing now, but with some of the new methods that we have been developed about estimating wildlife populations for various species. I know one of your colleagues there at the University of Florida. I've contributed some data to that project where he's trying to map out, some predator distributions of mesomammals
Hmm.
across, or I should say mesomammals in this case, not predators, because that's how he's looking at it. But
Hmm.
getting a better idea of how they're distributed and potentially relative abundance across the landscape. But while those data are still being processed, that leaves us with looking at trapping data for a lot of states and using trapping data as an index of abundance. Well, we do the same thing with turkeys, looking at hunter
Hmm.
harvest, and probably most of our listeners are aware of the problems that are associated with that. The number of actual birds that are killed in any given year. Well, first of all, that number has some error built into it to begin with because not all turkeys are getting reported, right? So
Hmm.
that that's part of the problem. In addition to that, just because a certain number of birds is killed doesn't mean that the population has changed. It's an index, not an actual, count or census. Because we also have to have information on how many people are hunting turkeys, which can be difficult because a lot of states allow you to hunt turkeys with a big game license, just like you buy for deer. Although some states are changing that as well too, so it's hard to differentiate. Did that person buy the license for deer or for turkeys? We don't know how intensively each of these individuals are hunting. We don't have a measure of catch per unit effort. So there's all sorts of reasons that those numbers, if we just look at the trend, for instance, of the number of raccoons captured, that is actually an indicator of population size. It may
Hmm.
tell us something about it, but overall, that's kind of a shaky data set to rely on. But I'll give all that detail to kind of arrive at the point that I think a lot of scientists that work with mesomammals are in pretty strong agreement that most of our more common species are at a greater abundance now than they have been over the past few decades.
Yeah, especially something like raccoons. Um, what do they call them? There's the scientists that are studying these are calling them like it's a human facilitated species essentially. Like
Hmm.
they're generalists, are well adapted. I mean, you hear about the raccoon in the garbage can kind of deal. You know what I'm saying? Like, but the other thing that people should keep in mind, and I think this is a perfectly reasonable inference to make, is given the amount that the landscape has changed, raccoons have habitat quality just like
Yeah.
turkeys do. And while a lot of the declines in habitat quality that we talk about with turkeys is actually the opposing relationship with raccoons. So the landscape has changed in a way that probably negatively affects productivity of turkeys, but the opposite side of that coin is it's also increasing habitat quality for raccoons.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't want to harp on that one, but that's a species that a lot of people focus on,
Right.
and there are several reasons to think that we might be in a landscape context where predators, particularly the raccoons, could be much more abundant because we have higher habitat quality on top of less predation. Uh, there's reason to believe that could be true.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
And then you go
So,
back to the historical writings, and they didn't even talk about raccoons eating nests. So
right.
that's all you hear about now.
Yeah. Right. So we've talked about, you know, some of the predators that eat turkeys at different life stages. The only life stage I think we still have to cover is the poult.
Hmm.
Everything eats a poult.
Yes.
Do we have very good data on how that breaks down by predator species?
I don't recall seeing really good data on that.
I haven't seen any either, and I think part of the reason for that is that we don't directly track a lot of poults.
Mhm.
That's kind of something that is fairly novel in the turkey research field. Is putting these micro transmitters on poults
Mhm.
because we haven't had the technology to make those small enough that they don't interfere with
Yeah.
survival or behavior up
I
until
think that
relatively recent.
and that's disappointing that we don't have that long history of data on it because of that
Hmm.
limitation, but the other side of that is we are now getting to a point where we're getting the technology to be able
Yeah.
to do that kind of stuff, and that's exciting because we've belabored this point and will in the future that our poult data is really the we know that there's a big limitation on the landscape in terms of poult rearing cover, but
Hmm.
also we have a real limitation in data because it's so hard, and it has been in not that long ago. It was impossible to track individuals and figure out what's going on with them, like what are they doing, where they
Hmm.
ended up, what's eating them.
Yeah.
And even still, with some of the new technology, we still have a limitation on figuring out what's happening to them farther into the year.
Hmm.
So, like at the end of the summer, basically through the fall, we're not tracking them.
Yeah. Yep. That's definitely a problem, and another one that I wanted to mention too, because we're going to try to do some of this summer as part of my Alabama research, is to not only transmitter those poults, but then when we get a mortality signal for one or one goes off the air, to try to actually determine its fate. But I think that's going to be really difficult because I mean, you think about it, if a hawk picks up a poult and consumes that entire poult, what's left to find? It may be that that carries it off far enough that we can't even pick up the transmitter. They don't transmit
Hmm.
that great of a distance because they're so small. So it may
Yep.
just go off the air and we never know what happened to it. Or maybe the hawk sits on a limb, picks the bird apart, is eating it, and the transmitter drops. We find it there, but you
Yeah,
know
and it's just a
the rest.
transmitter with no
Yeah, the
evidence.
rest of the bird's been totally consumed, so there's no sign to examine. So
Yeah.
um,
Well, there's
we've got a lot more progress to be made on that end.
yeah, and I feel like I saw this from one of the studies. I don't remember whose study, whether it was you or Chamberlain or one of these studies where there were some tagged poults in it. Didn't they end one ended up in a snake, a transmitter?
Did it?
Yeah, now I'm
Are you thinking of a? I'm thinking of a quail study, maybe where that happened.
maybe I am. Yeah, don't quote me on that, but that's still another point. Snakes are probably eating some poults.
Yeah, I know. I know in some of the quail work that's been done that those quail transmitters have ended up in all kinds of animals that
Yeah,
you wouldn't
you know
expect, like
what? You're right
bullfrogs.
now. I just thought of where that was. It
Yeah,
was a poult that ended up in a snake. So
yeah,
they
okay,
actually tracked the transmitter that was on, or no, it's quail chick. I think
yeah,
I just said poult again. It was
you did.
definitely a quail chick.
Yeah,
So sorry, I'm not trying to mislead you. I just have a terrible memory.
Yeah.
Uh, it was a quail chick that they tracked the transmitter into a snake's belly,
Did you
and
see the
it
one
was
that
in it.
ended up in a bullfrog?
I did,
Yeah.
yes. I'm glad you reminded me of that. I've forgotten about that. So same thing with quail. Everything out there wants to eat it, right?
Right.
And you end up with these really weird interactions sometimes, and they end up inside of a frog. I mean, come on.
Right.
Uh,
So
yeah. So
so
now
kinda
I guess we need to be frog gigging, you know.
yeah. So
uh,
where we really wanted to take this conversation though is to cover the complexity of this issue. And I think that what we've just discussed brings one of those first
hmm
points that we wanted to make to the table, and that's that even if predator control was highly effective at increasing turkey production, we know right off the bat that there are a number of turkey predators that we cannot legally control.
Yes.
So we've got the raptors.
hmm
You can kill crows, but you can't kill blue jays legally.
Yeah.
Snakes are protected in a lot of states.
Wait,
Um,
now, which kinds of snakes?
it
Because
depends on where you are.
you might want to look at your local
Right.
regulations.
And
Some folks that are bouncing around the snake they found, trying to get an ID on it.
I mean, I
You may
think the
want to.
status quo for most states is that venomous snakes are not protected, but non-venomous ones are
Mm.
protected. But that
Well, that's
again,
usually the question that we're getting. Is this something? What kind of snake is this? Is it
yeah,
one that could bite my children or whatever?
right, right. But those if non-venomous snakes are protected, I mean, rat snakes fall into that category,
Mm-hmm.
and they can be a major nest predator, and I'm sure they take some poults too. Just by I've personally seen them do it with my chickens.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So
Well, yeah. There's definitely. Again, uh, we're kind of getting off the science documentation because I haven't seen a really strong documentation with poults,
hmm
but perfectly reasonable. And I have been in part of some other studies where we were looking with small mammals, and the mammal ended up in a snake too.
hmm
So like with some of these tagging studies, we might start getting at that. I haven't
yeah,
seen the data, but I bet we'll start getting a pretty good handle on it in the near future with some of these studies that are tagging them.
right. So
But
moving,
that's a great point. You can't trap a lot of them legally.
yeah, right,
So you got a bunch of predators. We just talked about everything out there wants to eat an egg and a poult, and some of them will eat the adults too. And some of those we can't trap, and that's
right.
one problem. Another thing, I know I've heard you talk about it before with predator data. One data set we have pretty good indication of the trends of predators is with raptors. And
hmm
I do
Oh
you want
yeah,
to talk about that for a minute?
yeah. Raptor populations are definitely on the increase.
Okay. And where's that data coming from?
So that would be from, I believe that's Christmas bird count data, isn't it?
That's one data set. Yeah, that's the one that came into my head.
Yeah.
But there are a couple. The bird community has done a really great job
Yes.
in documenting trends in bird populations from
Right.
various
Very
data
consistent.
sets.
Very consistent across broad spatial scales over
hmm
large time spans. We generally see that raptor populations have been on the increase for quite a while. And I think really, the starting point for those population increases was kind of around the time that DDT was banned,
hmm
because it so negatively affected a lot of those species in that
Right.
category.
So we had a big stint of time when DDT may have really forced the abundance down of
hmm
those, and now they're recovering. Is that
Right.
what you're saying?
Yeah. I mean,
Okay.
that's part of it, but part of it I
Yeah.
think is going to be additional protections,
Sure.
Migratory Bird Treaty Act, all those types of things that have
Yeah. A
led
lot
to
of
increasing
legislation.
populations. Yeah.
hmm That makes sense. So that's a predator that definitely is based on all indications from probably our strongest data sets on such a thing,
Yeah.
are indicating they are on the increase and they're off limits.
Right. So we've established that, but let's just say, perfect world, we those none of those predators exist any longer. Okay. Does that guarantee that every egg is going to hatch and every poult from every egg that hatches is going to survive?
No. Very clean, no.
Why not?
Yeah, so there've been a couple of studies that I think really resonate with me. One uh, that was kinda striking to me is one that Mike Chamberlain and Brad Cohen and a couple of other authors published recently showing the thermal landscape
Mhm.
for poults, and it was really poor. It was about the same, actually, single digit percentages of the landscape would meet the thermal requirements of poults, and
So by
basically,
thermal requirements, you mean it's vegetation structure that's conducive to keeping them at the right temperature to survive.
yes. And a lot of people key in on them freezing to death, but they also can get too hot.
Yeah.
So, uh, that's just one example where we have pretty good data that they published. It's a great paper showing that the vegetation characteristics, the early succession that we keep talking about, the poult rearing cover on the landscape is really limited, that keeps the thermal environment in a range of temperatures that will not kill them,
Mhm.
which is a pretty powerful way to think about that, right? So in that scenario, if they're dying from exposure to temperature, it does not matter how many predators there are. That is not relevant at that point.
Mhm.
The limiting factor in that case is exposure, which is being driven by plants, not
Yeah.
by predators.
So what you're saying is even in the absence of predators, there's a certain number of these birds that are just going to die anyway.
Yeah, so we would call that compensatory mortality. And
Mhm.
people probably hear that term thrown around, and maybe it's not very intuitive what that is. But a lot of our game hunting, bag limit models are
Right.
focused on this idea of a maximum sustained yield, and part of that is we know that some number of the individuals are going to die, and we can harvest a certain number of those individuals, and you don't actually change how many die in the population
Mhm.
because hunting in that case is compensatory to other
Right.
sources of mortality.
Yeah.
So quail actually is a pretty cool example where even at the property level you see that implemented, where they know they can harvest X percent of the birds and they don't actually decrease the overall mortality of the birds, which
Right.
is pretty cool.
Yeah. You mean
So
increase the overall mortality.
that's correct. Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't know what I said.
You said
What?
decrease the overall
Oh,
mortality.
yeah. Increase. So basically, just, 30 or 40% of the animals are going to die. I'm just making
Mhm.
up a number, but
Right.
let's just pretend that we know if there were no predators, 30% are going to die.
Yeah.
And then you could add in predators, and there's some examples of this, or it's better with hunting, with us as the predator. But
Mhm.
there are examples of this where you add in the hunting bag limit or whatever, where people are actually removing individuals from the population and it doesn't
Mhm.
actually change that 30% die.
Yeah.
So, that's something that's not super intuitive to people who are not really in depth thinking about the science going
Mhm.
on.
Yeah.
But, a lot of populations operate that way where you have some number are going to die, and adding a predator in or removing that predator doesn't actually change how many are going to die,
Yeah. I
or
think
it doesn't, at least doesn't do it 1 to 1, right?
yeah, this is the really interesting stuff when we start getting in these population dynamics. I get a little bit excited because
Yeah, I see you on
just
the edge of your
just
seat now.
well, I'm thinking about how it all interacts, and I want to share this with people because I think it just increases my level of fascination for the natural world.
Yes.
As a baseline starting point, kind of a thought experiment, if you will, to try to understand this, because I know it's very abstract to a lot of
Hmm.
people to think about it. But like you already mentioned one example, Marcus, in that maybe we are in a predator free environment, but we don't have the right vegetation structure to keep poults warm or to keep them cool enough, right? So some are
Hmm.
going to die anyway. An even more extreme example of that is take some place on the landscape that we don't consider suitable for turkeys. Maybe just like a wide open park with short grass everywhere. I don't know. Or,
Mhm.
you can think of, or even a city, where those predators are either completely absent or at very low abundance. There's other resources that are more limiting in that
Mhm.
scenario. And I think this brings out a more important point, is that removing predators isn't going to have as much of an effect in situations where predators aren't the number one thing limiting the population. We call these limiting
Mhm.
factors.
Yes.
And we're in a scenario right now where we keep talking about one study after another showing that brooding cover is limited, severely so. And so, just because you remove predators, if that's still the limiting factor, you've still got that same bottleneck,
Mhm.
right?
Well, if we turn that around, you can imagine if you improve those vegetation conditions such that they're not going to die from exposure and they have plenty of food and they can grow really rapidly and all these different things, predators removal in that scenario might pay dividends
Mm-hmm.
because once you take the predation away, all those other things that were going to kill it don't kill it because
Right.
you've addressed them through that.
Right.
And I think that's something that the way you just put it, and hopefully I added to that, can really paint that picture to people why the predator removal. There's a lot of nuance to that
Yeah.
conversation, and this is one of the ways that habitat is integrating into this because of things like compensatory mortality, where if you have a bunch of mortality sources that are associated with poor habitat quality, they can provide a much stronger compensatory role to predation,
Mm-hmm.
where you can remove the predation even entirely in some
Right.
cases and still have the same mortality of the individuals in the population because of those compensatory influences of habitat.
Right. And conversely, if let's say we're in a situation where predation is a limiting factor, we know that populations are never going to grow. You'll never experience unlimited growth, right? Something
Mhm.
else will become a limiting factor. Now you may end up with way more turkeys than you started with, but a good example that comes to mind for me is, let's say it's in South Texas and you remove all the predators in that scenario. Well, what happens when there are no good suitable roosts available any longer? You run
Mhm.
out of roosting habitat,
Yep.
right? So then birds don't have a good place to roost, and you know their mortality rate increases. So there's going to be a limiting factor on populations regardless. Now, I'm not saying this is making a case against removing predators, but just
Well, people need
trying
to
to illustrate this
understand this.
dynamic. Yeah.
Yeah. You need to understand this when you're considering trapping as a tool. And by the way, I think it's our next episode. We're going to go into the literature on trapping
Yes.
specifically. So don't think we're not presenting you that data. We're carrying on for quite a while here, and we have to break these into multiple episodes.
Right.
Uh, so I think that's a really important point. It's not, we tend to gravitate toward food or predators being limiting factors, but the fact of the matter is it can be lots of other things too.
Yeah.
And we
Absolutely.
just, you're trying to adjust. People might have heard the old saying that you fix the lowest leaky hole in the bucket.
Right.
That's kind of what we're doing right here, right? If predators are a hole that's up at the top of the bucket, fixing that one's not going to help you keep the water in the bucket if there's a hole nearer to the bottom. Like the
Exactly.
water's going to move down. So it's the same kind of thing here. Um, there are some other things that add to the complexity to this too. And I
Hmm.
think one of the studies that really resonates with me, and I know you have some data as well, and I want you to discuss those. Was actually with coyotes from the South Carolina Savannah River site study.
Hmm.
So they had a long term study. They were focused on fawns, but this is important data from the coyote aspect for this discussion. They had two sites, I guess, tens of thousands of acre trapping treatments where they
I think they had.
intensively.
It's been a while. I think it was three 8,000 acre areas
Okay,
that they trapped on.
All right. Well, we can share the paper so you can get the actual numbers. But they were trapping at a really large scale, very intensively, and right before fawning or leading right up to fawning.
Mm-hmm.
And there was something that work led to. Basically, they kept doing the trapping intensively, and they never ran out of coyotes.
Yeah, I think over the whole course of the study, they trapped, for a few years,
Hmm.
and if I remember correctly, their total coyote catch was somewhere in the 400s.
Yeah. So tons of coyotes, and they didn't run out of them. So they did a follow up study that was really cool, and they were trying to figure out two uh, hypotheses.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, they were trying to see if they had support for one of them on why they didn't run out of coyotes. Because most
Mm-hmm.
people are probably like, well, if you're really intensively removing coyotes at that large of a scale, well, then you're just going to get rid of coyotes. But that's not what happened. So they tried to figure out, based on genetics, two other possibilities. One would be you're going to hear this compensatory word a lot. So one of them is compensatory reproduction, and the other one is compensatory immigration. And all that fancy stuff means is that if you trap predators, if there's compensatory immigration, that means you trap predators and the ones from the surrounding environment move in to take that niche
Mm-hmm.
space.
Right.
So if you trap a coyote today, you have a coyote from somewhere else tomorrow. That's
And
what that
that
means.
and compensatory immigration in particular poses a major challenge to individuals who would want to try to control predator populations on small properties.
Yes.
Yeah, the
And
smaller.
what is a small property for a coyote might be thousands of acres,
Yeah,
like literally, because we
absolutely.
actually had some interesting data on some coyote movements that really opened my eyes to this,
Yeah.
where we collared a bunch of coyotes in North Carolina, and some of them went all the way down to the Georgia line. They
Mm-hmm.
saw you down there with all your trapping coyote studies. It was at that same time they turned around and came back almost, and
This
then
guy ain't
settled
collaring
shop.
him; he's killing him.
We need to turn back around, turn this. So one of them did that and ended up somewhere in South Carolina, and we got a picture on a game cam of our collared coyote that we've collared hundreds of miles away from there. It was
Yeah.
kind of crazy. And then another one, it ended up near Washington D.C.
Oh,
And
running for
if you
office.
actually, I don't know what it was doing. It's yeah, anti-trapping campaign, I guess. Uh, yeah. So, but anyway, like we had that coyote collared, and if you actually connect the dots on how far did it have to walk in only a few months time period, it wasn't like it was over years.
Yeah.
In only a few months, the straight line distance that it would have had to walk at a minimum, just connecting all the dots, was like 900 miles.
Right.
So just think about that for a minute. That is crazy far.
Yeah.
So I could trap a coyote where I'm at right now, and one in Gainesville, Florida, and I could end up with a coyote where you're at
Right.
a few months later in
Yeah.
Auburn,
Yeah.
coming all the way down. That's crazy.
Yeah. So those are
So
extreme examples,
yes,
but but
but it does put into light that
yeah.
compensatory immigration, how that could be a really
Yeah.
big factor.
Yeah, and but I mean, even in your typical coyote, uses thousands of acres.
Hmm.
1,500 is not that big
Yeah.
for an individual. I think the smallest home range of a coyote I've ever seen was a female that had pups, and she was using about 500 or 600 acres.
Hmm.
But
Oh, that's
typically
good.
we see them using areas north of 1,000 acres.
Right.
But that's residents, right? So we have
Yeah.
two categories. We have resident coyotes, which are about 60 to 70% of the population, and the remaining percentage of the population, usually around somewhere around 30, depending on the study. They don't even have a home range. They're just
Hmm.
bouncing all around the landscape, and that's like
Yeah.
the
It's like
individuals
they're just
that you're
looking for
talking
a
about.
spot or something.
Right, right.
Yeah. They're what would you call them? Nomads or what you?
Yeah, nomads or
Okay.
yeah. I mean, I think
That's a good term for
that's
them.
probably the most accurate term.
So the other thing to put into perspective, and one of the reasons that this is a difficult thing to address, right, with trying to figure out what to do and how much it'll work and what your context and why all this thing might vary is obviously that is an extreme because coyotes are super mobile and they're more
Hmm.
mobile than some of the other predators. So you may not need as big of an imprint of trapping
Right.
to affect other predators as you would with that one. But I think that is a good example of how something like compensatory immigration could really confound
Right.
some of the expected responses that you're implementing trapping for.
But even
Uh,
with
um,
a mature male raccoon, they can use several hundred acres.
yeah, yeah, that's true.
So
So that's a good point.
easier to
And that doesn't
control.
that's not even, you're talking about home range. That's not even that doesn't mean that's all they can
No,
disperse, right?
that's
They
right.
might actually disperse much farther. I don't know what the numbers are on raccoons, but it's certainly bigger than home ranges.
Right.
So the other one that I wanted to bring up, because it's one that probably resonates a little more with people on one of the issues, because a lot of people are dealing with pigs, and it comes up with pigs a lot
Hmm.
when they're trapping pigs and trying to get them removed, is that compensatory reproduction.
Yep.
And what that essentially means, if we're just trying to break it down into the most non-scientific way I can think of, is if you trap a bunch of pigs or raccoons or pigs. I already said pigs. Coyotes.
Pigs or raccoons or pigs.
Yeah, yeah. When you're trapping a species like that, because you decrease competition, or there's more resources per individual, or there's lots of different kinds of mechanisms that this could happen. But essentially, if they expand their litter size in response to that, that'd be compensatory reproduction.
Yeah.
Or you might see it in a different way, like maybe the survival of the young is density dependent. We're going to get a lot into density dependence, and we've got a whole series on it. But essentially, like if you trapped pigs and the mothers start producing more piglets as a
Hmm.
response to the more resources, or if the piglets have higher survival because there's less competition, or whatever the mechanism, there could be lots of things going on. That would be a compensatory reproduction mechanism.
Hmm.
So
Right.
basically, there's more babies being born, or more of them are surviving to adulthood. Or in the case of pigs, some people have discussed even maybe they start reproducing at a younger age.
Hmm.
Uh, so there are lots of ways that you could have compensatory reproduction, but all that to say is just because you remove animals doesn't mean that you have less of them, because it could one of these mechanisms could kick in,
Yeah.
and we know that fur bearers and some of these other species that we're talking about, some of them have the capability to do those, to exhibit those kinds of
Yeah.
mechanisms.
Yeah. These two are really important to keep in mind if you were to try to attempt predator control,
Hmm.
because compensatory immigration and compensatory reproduction, you already highlighted how that can pose a challenge to reducing populations. The other thing that it highlights as far as predator control goes is that you already know right off the bat that if you want to trap predators, see a corresponding increase in turkeys, and continue to enjoy that into the future, you're going to have to do it again.
Hmm.
Very often,
Yeah,
repeatedly, often every, if you're trying to focus on nest predators, every nesting season, you're pretty much going to have to do it.
yeah.
Um,
Well, and I think one of our other guests really highlights this well. We
mhm,
So do we on the other, like, habitat management practices. So
right.
that doesn't necessarily mean that you shouldn't do it, that you have to do it
No,
repeatedly, because we have to do all this stuff repeatedly. And when we talk to one of our next couple of guests, they really laid that out well, and I thought
yeah,
that was a good conversation piece from him. Um, yeah, but you're right. We're just trying to tell you why the equation is more complex. I think that's how we started
mhm,
this.
yeah,
And in the South Carolina study, they actually tried to figure out why they didn't run out of coyotes, even though they were at a really large scale with really intensive
right.
trapping for a long term,
Yeah,
multiple years.
those are professional trappers
Yeah,
trapping thousands of acres, before dirt and throughout the fawning season, and that hole in the bucket just kept filling back up,
yeah.
you
They
know?
just they didn't get rid of the water. It just kept coming back. So, uh,
Those guys
do
were
you,
trapping day in and day out.
do you remember in that case why from the
Why what?
genetics? Why did they not run out of them?
They
You
were
remember which?
immigrating.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I didn't know if you remembered. I did. Yeah, so the compensatory immigration was what they found in that particular study. Now that's just with coyotes, and it was only in one study, but it was a really
Mhm.
well done study, and I think it's certainly relevant here when we're just talking about you know the predator aspect. We need to know
Right.
what's eating predators and what the limitations are, and what our options are, and what to expect out of that. And
Right.
I think the next episode, when we actually quantify the effectiveness of the practice from the literature,
Mhm.
that'll really put things into perspective for people.
Yeah. I'll add to that that I think the compensatory reproduction aspect is the one that most hunters that I've talked to, what immediately comes to mind for them is that, oh, if I remove coyotes, do the remaining ones just reproduce faster? Um, and they really haven't thought of compensatory immigration before.
Hmm.
And the difference in those two is that, compensatory reproduction, that takes a little bit of time for the population to recover because, obviously they have to reproduce, go through the gestation period, and then those pups have to be raised up to the size that they become turkey predators or deer predators or whatever, your
Hmm.
focus is on that property. But with immigration, man, it can happen really over a matter of weeks almost as soon as you
Yeah.
back off.
Well, think of with the coyotes in particular. I mean, trapping a coyote and then having one replace it from two counties over, like
Yeah,
3 days from now.
right. It's
That's the kind of
frustrating.
that's the scale of movement we're talking about.
Yeah.
And you know that I'm not trying to be controversial about the trapping, but these are real things that we're having.
Challenges.
They're challenges that we're trying to deal with. And the fact of the matter is, most people are not controlling enough contiguous landscape
Mhm.
to deal with some of these problems well.
Yeah.
So, well, I think we have pretty well covered a lot of the predators that eat turkeys. I think people probably, for the most part, knew a lot of that,
Oh, yeah.
and hopefully they still learned some from some of that dialogue. But in my experience, when we're trying to think objectively about predators and the integration of trapping into a management regime, people uh, are less keen on some of that information we just shared. So hopefully everybody appreciates that dialogue
Mhm.
because
Yeah.
again, we're trying to present you all the information. And our next episode, we're really going to focus hard on the efficacy of trapping based on the studies that we have in the literature.
Yeah. And, just to kinda tease that a little bit, I mean, you know, we have limited data on the efficacy of predator control for increasing turkey populations, and there's some caveats associated with a couple of studies that we do have, but in spite of all this that we've talked about today, there's a little bit of a silver lining. There are some positive shown benefits that we'll discuss, but just like I said, we've got to put that in the right context and
Hmm.
consider whether those positive results are something that the average person would be able to reasonably replicate on their
Hmm.
property.
Yeah, I think that's one important part that we're going to go into in detail, and we need to, as we hear people say, you need to do it intensively at the right time and at the right scale, but nobody actually says what that is.
Yeah.
So we can try to shed some light on that with the data that we have access to through these studies. So good stuff.
Look forward to it, man.
I'm so glad that you you were sequencing DNA from humans, Cat. Oh, that's
It was
awesome.
contamination.
Well, then I have more questions that come from that. It
You
doesn't
like a
help.
good you like a good poop story almost as much as my 7-year-old daughter.
My 6-year-old daughter is really keen on the poop jokes too.
They're at that age they're fully embracing the potty humor.
Yeah, yep.
And
The potty humor is
I'm kind of here for it.
yeah, yep.
My wife gives me side eyes all the time, but every now and then,
That's the same.
especially because my 3-year-old's getting on it too with what he's learning from his older sister, and he'll just randomly drop a poop every here and there, as in not like physically, but verbally.
Well,
He'll
a
say,
little bit of both. A little bit.
well, he does that, but he'll say it. He'll say it
Speaking
every
of
now and then,
contamination.
and I can't help but chuckle. So
Yeah. Well, there've been a few of those jokes that my daughter has brought up that she just made up her own. It was really fun when she started making her own jokes, because a lot of them don't make sense, but sometimes they're so hilarious because they don't make sense. Now she's to a point where she can come up with some pretty complex thought that is like, wow, okay, that's cool that you're even thinking at that level, and it's also funny because it's so clever. But when she first started trying to tell her own jokes, she had some really good ones.
mine asked me to rate her jokes out of 5 stars. I'm not kidding.
Yeah,
And
like
she
it's
gets
a podcast.
yeah.
Yeah,
And
rate my joke. That's great.
yeah. So speaking of which, she normally gets 2 and 3 out of 3s, but we're hoping that you'll, go and review our podcast, and hopefully we get a 5 out of 5.
So cliche.
You didn't like that
make you
segue?
feel? How did that make you feel?
A little dirty.
No, it is
But
important, and we
it is
keep bringing it up
important.
because it's important. But I'm gonna have to stop you because that was pretty cliche.
Yeah, that was. All right. Charlotte, please edit that out.
Can you just edit Will out of this whole episode? Charlotte, please let's just take Will out of this one.
Except for the jokes.
Yeah, we can't take the poop joke out. I've never laughed so hard on the air ever. That's hilarious. All right, folks. Thanks everybody for listening this long. If we kept a few of you, I'm really appreciative that you stuck around this long. Thank you.
Wild Turkey Science is part of the Natural Resources University podcast network and is made possible by Turkeys for Tomorrow, a grassroots organization dedicated to the wild turkey. To learn more about TFT, check out turkeysfortomorrow.org.